Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with John and Greg, both from Move to Amend. And we're going to have a pretty wide ranging conversation, I think, both about the work that you all have been doing, the Constitution in general, how we're looking at the world, what we see going forward, so on and so forth. So, John and Greg, thanks so much for joining us. I was hoping that we could start with some introductions, including how you both came to focus on the Constitution, came to this type of work. John, would you go ahead and start off?
Sure. And Luke, thank you for the opportunity to discuss these important issues. My name is John Fioretta. I'm a retired career prosecutor. The assignment I spent the most time on was environmental protection. I've lived most of my life in San Jose, California. My three passions are public service, justice, and the environment. I've volunteered for Move to Amend for the past 13 years and serve on its Law and Research Committee as well as in my local affiliate group. And I came to this group in part because I thought it was getting to the heart of the most important and difficult and consequential issues facing our country. We must get corporate power and big money in politics solved, or we won't get anything else resolved.
Yeah, well, hey, Luke, thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it. Yeah, and always good to be with John. How I sort of came into all this is let's see, I think it was 33 years. I worked for a Quaker related organization called the American Friends Service Committee. National's been around since 1917, won the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1947, that year, we edged out Gandhi, apparently. There was still skirmish post Indian independence and the like. And so Nobel Committee was going to wait 1 year before they awarded him the Nobel Prize, and unfortunately, he was assassinated. But anyway, in working with that organization in Northeast Ohio, I live in greater Cleveland area, and this was Northeast Ohio, part of the Midwest region. I like a lot of activists, educated, advocated, and organized with diverse groups, organizations, constituencies on all kinds of issues related to peace and justice, anti-war, and nonviolence, trade, budget priorities, housing, poverty, hunger, all the poverty, local currencies and environmental issues. And doing all that work, I came to realize that it was not getting us very far. And that was because I got involved. It was in 1996 I got invited to a weekend workshop sponsored by an outfit called the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy. How's that for a mouthful? Or POCLAD, POCLAD, POCLAD.org is their website. And it was called Rethinking Democracy, Rethinking the Corporation. And it was one of those, you hear about people saying having an aha experience. That was it for me, because what it did was it helped the group itself sort of worked on trying to what they called unearth the history of the relationship between people and corporate entities, which included, examining the history of the Constitution. And so I became, after going through this weekend workshop, became involved with that group, sort of a collective think tank, if you will. And so from the mid 90s onward, I was involved in doing research on corporate power, how corporations came to have the power they did, and how it related to the Constitution and the Constitution itself, and sort of the power between the Federalists, Anti-Federalists, and issues between public and private, and who were considered persons versus property, and a lot of these other aspects. Why the Bill of Rights weren't included in the original Constitution, and how democratic versus undemocratic it was. So that was my first exposure to all these issues back, really beginning in the mid '90s. So well before, like the Citizens United decision that got Move to Amend going.
Well, it's always interesting to hear where folks are coming from and the different experiences that bring us to where we are, and in this case, bring us to looking at the Constitution as a major obstacle to many of the various problems in the world that we're also familiar with. Could you both talk about Move to Amend and the group's origins, and then also your current work. And if Greg, you could start us off.
Yeah. Well, Move to Amend is an outfit organization, national coalition that's been around since the very day of the Citizens United decision back in January 2010. And so people, like 5 months beforehand, there were like a dozen people that met in a living room somewhere in California and said, oh, this is not looking good in terms of how this Supreme Court seems to be moving. And so we better sort of figure out what we're going to do, and decided to preemptively organize and guess that the Supreme Court was going to rule to give corporate entities and well-to-do people even more power and rights, i.e. constitutional rights, than they already had. And so Move to Amend formed on that very day of the Citizens United decision. The website went up, and the mission from the get-go was to focus on economic and social justice, ending corporate rule, and building a vibrant democracy that was accountable to the people and not corporate interests. And specifically, what that meant was, yes, it was from the very beginning designed to reverse Citizens United, but was under no illusion, since many of the people who were involved in the organization had been doing, like I was doing, activism in all these other arenas, and realized they weren't getting far enough fast enough, and they weren't really changing the fundamentals because, as oftentimes we say, the system, government isn't broken, but rather it's fixed or rigged. And that rigging has to do with the fundamental ground rules of the system, which is the Constitution. And so Move to Amend said, yeah, we have to look at reversing Citizens United, but in addition, go back and look at some of these constitutional decisions, court decisions that go back, in some cases, a couple decades to the 1970s, that equated money as free speech, and even further back when corporate entities were deemed a person. They go back to the 1880s. So the decision was, hey, we need to sort of get rid of all that and abolish all of that as a stepping stone. Not even say that's enough, but as a stepping stone to even more constitutional, renewal. And so, our principles and values from the get-go was to say, we need to build a movement that's focused on solidarity organizing, anti-oppression, that's really trying to form coalitions, that's really based on the grassroots, and is dedicated to getting on the other side of the learning curve. We got to do a hell of a lot of education because, we didn't learn this stuff in school about how corporate entities amass power and the like. And then really what's so important, we felt from the beginning, is to be both politically and economically, and they're interconnected, politically and economically independent, because, we just can't afford to be connected in any way, shape, or form to, big foundations, corporate entities, super duper wealthy individuals, the government, political parties, because they pull strings or, push whatever that can temper or moderate you. And, if we're working on trying to focus on fundamental change, then we got to be independent, which means we have to focus on people who support us and focus on people at the grassroots. So anyway, that's sort of a brief background of who we are and the like. In my work, I'm one of the co-directors at Move to Amend, and generally what we do and what we focus on is, one of the main programs from the beginning was to pass an amendment, which has been introduced in subsequent, like 5 subsequent Supreme Court or congressional sessions, that is called the We the People Amendment, that calls for abolishing the twin constitutional doctrines or judge-made laws of money is not speech and a corporation is not a person. So a big part of what we do is, get that to the extent we can, to get that not just introduced, but then supported in Congress. So that's one thing we do. And then we try to build a base of support. And so part of my work is, like with the other co-directors, as well as active volunteers like John and people at the affiliate level, to, build that grassroots out by gaining support from organizations. So we have endorsements, over 800 endorsing organizations. We try to get communities to pass resolutions, symbolic to be sure, but nevertheless, to build the culture, to build the awareness. Over 700 communities have passed resolutions or citizen-driven ballot initiatives. We circulate petitions. We get candidates to take what we call a pledge to amend, so that if they're elected, then they can, we get them to commit to, if elected, will they do what they can in the capacity that they're elected in to promote, introduce a resolution, or, get something going, have a public hearing in their community. So things like that. And then we work with other groups to try to build a coalition, build this out. And we, try to focus now more recently on saying, it's got to be more than just getting this amendment passed. It's the whole Constitution, the undemocraticness of it that goes way back. We, the people, have never been all the people. So we really do need to be working with others who are concerned about maybe other aspects of constitutional renewal that is needed, that we can maybe work together, because if change is going to happen on the constitutional front, it may not happen one amendment at a time, or, maybe one amendment at a time, but there may be a need to come at this collectively. So we're beginning to reach out to other like-minded groups.
Move to Amend has either affiliate groups and or advocates in 21 states. And I originally joined as a member of our affiliate group in Santa Clara County, California, which is, basically the San Jose, South Bay area, Silicon Valley. So my activities originally were trying to get resolutions passed by local city councils and the Board of Supervisors, getting letters to the editor and op-eds written and published in local newspapers, going to our members of Congress for our area and trying to get them to become co-sponsors of the We the People Amendment, which is now HJR 54 in the current Congress. And then once we got all our local members of Congress on board, which we have, take a step further out to try and help other either groups or advocates in the Central Valley, for example, to try and get their members of Congress to support the We the People Amendment as well. Tabling to get the word out at community events, farmers markets, political campaign meetings, protests, you name it. We've marched in protests. So all the kinds of things that a local grassroots volunteer does to advance his or her cause, we've been trying to do, giving presentations to organizations. Then after being part of the organization for a fairly long time, because of my legal background, I got on the Law and Research Committee. And initially we were trying to come up with short but accurate and layperson friendly publications to make sure that members had something they could go to, either to give to their elected officials or to get them up to speed on what we were doing and the various topics, legal and otherwise, that would come up. In my experience, it was fairly common to get specific legal questions from members of Congress, and we had to respond. And we have a whole website full of helpful materials to respond to those questions. I want to emphasize one thing that Greg mentioned. We do a lot of educating, and it certainly has affected me. We have a movement education program, and even though I consider myself an American history buff, I didn't realize how whitewashed, literally and figuratively, our history was until I went through our movement education program, and continued to educate myself through Move to Amend on the topic of corporate constitutional rights. And it's it's really important to have that background to know how we got here and why it doesn't have to be this way and why it shouldn't be this way. So those are the projects that I've been most working on. And again, to emphasize something Greg pointed out, we are now making a bigger effort to reach out to other organizations, because it's not just one amendment that is going to turn this thing around, not with the current democracy crisis in our country. We need fundamental systemic change throughout the Constitution, and that requires a social movement, and that requires all of us and all our organizations. If you're progressive, we need to get together.
If I can follow up with you on that, John, and Greg, feel free to chime in too. How do you sort of make the pitch, if you will, to those other organizations? Do you relate it to what they're also involved in and say this is why the Constitution impacts those things too? How do you have those conversations with folks?
We are, even though we have been working with allied groups for a long time, we are just now having the kind of conversation that I described. In other words, the situation has gotten so dire, we can't afford to work individually anymore. We must come together for any of us to be successful. And regardless of what your issue is, if it's the environment, if it's universal health care, if it's tax reform, if it's gun control, if it's immigration, it ain't happening unless there is fundamental constitutional reform and we get a true majoritarian system in the Constitution, as opposed to the minoritarian one we have now, in which our checks and balances aren't working. As Greg mentioned, it's a rigged system, and it is denying the will of the majority to get what they want. There's plenty of public opinion polls that say what the American people want, and they're not getting it because of the power of money and corporations. We're still looking for the best way to address this, but I really think the dire situation of the country now is probably the biggest selling point. And if there's one silver lining to the current clouds, it's that the Trump administration is galvanizing progressives to come together to finally address these issues.
I would just say that in quick response, there really are two different kinds of groups that we would want to and have reached out to. The one are the single issue organizations that work on healthcare and environment and those sorts of things, where the pitch there is, and understood that metaphorically it's going to be hard to get past first base in doing what it is you want to do, because the whole system is just so fixed against you. And maybe you do win on some technicality, but you're not going to win on fundamental. You'll get one slice of the loaf, if that, and you'll get the one slice this year, but then they'll take it away because it's a law, right? I mean, look at the healthcare, the Affordable Care Act. Now they're pulling that back. That was supposed to be a great victory, and even that was wholly inadequate. And you can just go down the lines of environmental stuff that they just regulate how much poisons are in the air, and it's still dangerous, but it's regulated now, and then they pull that back. So the argument and the strategy there in approaching is, it's going to be hard to get there. Now, the other kind of group reaching out to are amendment groups, other groups that are focusing on a constitutional amendment. You don't have to sell that we need a constitutional amendment there, because they are already working on it, but they may be working on a different amendment. So the key there is to say, we need to sort of come together and say together that there is no one solution. There is no single magic bullet. There are a lot of things that are fundamentally wrong, fundamentally unjust, fundamentally undemocratic, fundamentally unsustainable environmentally with the current Constitution. So we got to come at this by saying together that this is needing some fundamental change that goes beyond any of our individual ones.
I wanted to turn to this question of posing things as an amendment and just the amendment process. We've seen just how hard it is to get amendments through the existing Constitution, pass bills through the Constitution, get an actual constitutional amendment. It's just so dang hard to get into law what we need, and then let alone change the existing document. So how do you all work with that? I get the sense that while there are groups out there that I think put too much focus on just passing that amendment and aren't looking at the overarching structure, that's not the case here. You all are very much aware of how the larger system works. So how do you reckon with that? The framing of this discussion as move to amend, but also how hard it is to do that. And Greg, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, well, I think the first step is to acknowledge exactly what you have said. Absolutely, positively, it is darn hard. It is, as some people have said, the hardest constitution on planet Earth to amend. And it was designed that way. I mean, let's face it was designed that way. The winners, of course, write the rules. And so the winners, the Federalists, if you will, got rid of the king, replaced themselves, the elite, white, wealthy people. There's some good things about Constitution, but they made sure it was going to be darn hard to amend to sort of insulate themselves and those who would come after them. So absolutely, positively, extremely hard. How many hundreds of amendments have been introduced? How many have we gotten? A handful. So yes, it is difficult. And boy, do we wish there was an easier route to go. I mean, this is not by choice. I would love it if all we had to do was elect better people, or just pass better laws, or have better regulations, or just, voila, have an executive, although the president's trying through an executive decision to wipe out the Constitution. I wish it was, in a sense, that easy to change, but it isn't. It's very difficult, and it's been designed that way. But nevertheless, that's sort of the cards we've been dealt. And if you're going to have fundamental change, then it's got to be this way. So we're under no illusions that this is easy, or that this amendment is all by itself the single answer. But what it is a hook. It's an example. It's something that's actually I mean, just think for a moment of the fundamental change, democratic changes that people really want out there that's been talked about. How many of those have actually been introduced? I mean, never mind, they're not going anywhere, but just being introduced in Congress as an amendment. Very, very few. So what this does by having it introduced is it provides the opportunity, the excuse, the hands-on ability to educate, to advocate, to organize, to give experience to people to work on doing all of those things via a constitutional amendment, as opposed to trying to educate, advocate, and organize and trying to pass a law, or trying to elect somebody, or trying to, get a new regulation. We all know sort of how to do that yields sometimes success, sometimes not success. But even when you're successful, again, because the rules are the way they are, you're not going to get very far, because we operate in a box. We're trapped in this box, and that box is the Constitution, the rules of the Constitution. So you can elect better people, have better laws, have better regulations, but you can't operate out of this box unless you change the rules of the game. So how to do those kinds of things within the framework of a Constitution amendment is very different. But we have to do it because it gives us experience. It gives us sort of the know-how when the opportunity comes, if it comes, but I think it will, because people are starting to figure out now we can't elect our way out of this. We can't statutorily get our way out of this. We can't regulatorily get our way out of this. We can't executive decision our way out of this. We got to constitutionally amend our way out of this, good or bad. That's where it is. So I mean, there's all sorts of specifics behind that we can get into of the uniqueness of working on an amendment that I think is really important, from helping people know what it takes and to help people see the connections and to do the education and the advocacy and the organizing. But maybe I'll just say this, maybe most importantly, why trying to focus on the Constitution, particularly an amendment approach and our amendment approach, is that it can break through the ingrained belief that the Constitution should not be, left to other people. That this should be on our social change agenda. That average people have the knowledge. We have the experience. We're told that the common narrative by the powers to be in our society is, oh, leave this to the expert. You all activists out there just worry about, elections and dealing with your single issues and, dealing with changing a law and the like. Don't focus on Constitution. That's what the constitutional law professors do. That's what the experts do. That's what the politicians do if we want to do it. Just focus on all that stuff. But don't engage in focusing on trying to change the systemic governing rules of society. Well, of course, that is absurd. And our own history is, Exhibit A, B, C, and D, where people coming together did change the Constitution by forming a movement. And because people's movements in other countries, look at our brothers and sisters elsewhere in some other places, when there have been fundamental change, and call it revolution, they not only get rid of their leaders, oftentimes who are dictators, they not only change laws, they change the fundamental rules. And so we got to learn the lessons of that. As damn difficult as that is, that nevertheless is really the only way to proceed.
If I could put two bookends on this, yes, I understand the skepticism of anyone who says, oh, this is too hard. It took 70 years, more than 70 years, for the women's suffrage amendment to pass. That said, would anyone say it wasn't worth the battle? On the other side, the other bookend is the 26th Amendment giving 18-year-olds the right to vote. There, the stars aligned. 18-year-olds were dying in Vietnam, and there was a general consensus here in the country that, yes, they should have the right to vote, and that passed in a few months. So things can change, and things can change rapidly, and therefore I don't think we should be despairing of the difficulty that we have to go through to get something passed because of the times that we are in. And I think it presents a big opportunity for getting something done because of the social upheaval that is going on now.
There are people, our friends on the other side of the political spectrum, that are talking about constitutional change, fundamental constitutional change, and in fact are talking about having a constitutional convention, which is one of the two ways that amendments happen. So just think for a moment, if and when that opportunity presents itself, think of 9/11. Think of when, that chaos emerged and people said, oh, we need to do something fundamental to address this thing. That, maybe not a great example at all corresponding, but the Patriot Act had been tried to be rammed through Congress. It didn't get anywhere. But Patriot Act was there. It was together. It had been tried to be advocated for, and they pulled it off the shelf and said they're ready to go. We need to put together a plan that is more than just the We the People amendment. This is the reason for people coming together. There are people coming together saying we need, all kinds of amendments. That's not just trying to stop things, but trying to promote things. Let's embed in the Constitution health care for all. Maybe different ways of electing people that's more inclusive. And I mean, sortition. There's all kinds of stuff being talked about, rights of nature and all. If we're not working on that now, if we're not developing the language, the experience, the culture, the confidence associated with that, we will not be able to fill that vacuum if and when it happens. And vacuums don't last long empty. They will be filled by someone or something. And so we have to be ready for that reason.
Yeah, what's coming to mind is, as you both have expressed, is just the different ways that people respond to the proposition that we need to talk about the Constitution. I think within my little space of the Democratic Socialists of America, I've talked about the DSA and other places, there is a section that will say, though I think a smaller section, something along the lines of, well, exactly because the right is talking about a constitutional convention, regardless of if that's possible or they'll get there, that we should actually not discuss the Constitution, because to broach that subject is to somehow play into their plan. I think that's wrong for the reasons that, Greg, you were discussing, the need to create something. The fact that people who we might not agree with are talking about the Constitution is just all the more reason why we should also be engaging in that conversation. And then I think the majority response is one that's critical of the Constitution, but doesn't quite know how to grapple with it. And because there isn't an idea of how to grapple with it, because it just seems too big, perhaps feels too abstract, then folks continue on sort of doing their different projects without, as I think we'd agree, getting to the whole, getting to the heart of the matter. And then there's
absolutely
this
right. Yeah,
sort
absolutely
of
right.
residual, and then there's this sort of residual, I think, overcoming of the idea that, well, democracy isn't radical enough. We can think of other things that are more radical, or, but what if we got the democracy? Would that allow us to do X, Y, and Z thing? Which I think just starts to get into the, a realm that we don't have yet, because we don't have this democracy.
Yeah.
So all that to say, all different kinds of ways that people can react to this conversation.
Yeah. There's one other point to bring up, and John, maybe you would want to comment on this, because he's been reaching out, is, our law and committee, Law and Research Committee, has been reaching out to constitutional professors. And there is now, within that field, within that academic arena, a growing sense, not just that, philosophically, but actually, we do need some serious, significant change. John, I don't know if you want to just speak to that. Another reason why this is becoming, I think, relatively speaking, more mainstream.
Yeah, right now, Move to Amend's official position is we want to go by way of amendment, not constitutional convention. However, we have always left open the possibility of going by way of convention if that was the only way this was going to happen. What Greg is alluding to is we monitor legal scholarship, political science scholarship, political economy scholarship. And I would say over the last year, there has been, I don't think explosion is too extreme a word to say, of all the articles that have been written in that recognize the problem isn't just this or that. It is the constitutional structure that is frustrating all reform. And because of that, in my opinion, it seems like that would make a convention more likely, because that would be the only way to address all those issues, as opposed to going one amendment at a time, especially given all the difficulties Greg has already talked about, and getting them all through Congress. So for those reasons, there may be some agreement between the left and the right to have a convention. What is scary, I think, to progressives now is that any convention that was in which the delegates were picked by state governors or state legislatures would be heavily tilted to the right, not because most people hold those views, but because of our gerrymandered system. So we have to get around that or work through it in order to get a fair constitutional convention. But the fact that the legal scholarship is recognizing the broad-based reform that is necessary, we think is a harbinger of what people in general are going to have to be told. The U.S. Constitution is rightly revered for everything that it has done for us, but like anything else that's over 200 years old, it needs a revamp. And for all the issues that we're faced with now that were never foreseen at the time of the framing, it needs an overhaul. So for all those reasons, I think a convention may be more likely than not in order to get true reform.
This is an interesting part that I'd like to linger on. How you all have noticed ideas changing or conversations changing. You all have been talking about this stuff for a little while, so you have that advantage, perhaps, of having interacted with folks around these issues for a long time. And then we're all living, I think, in a particular moment in which, changes, I agree, can be seen perhaps, every few months, every year. So how have you seen people's ideas changing around the Constitution?
When I talk to people at, say, a public event and try to get them to sign on to our petition, or if I'm giving a presentation, I generally speaking get three responses. There's a large group that as soon as they hear you say, we want to get rid of corporate rights and we want to take big money out of politics, they're just grabbing for your clipboard. They want to sign on immediately. They get it. Okay, so that's response number one. Response number two is, it's too hard. It'll never happen. And response number three is eyes glazing over. Okay, so we have our work cut out for us. But I think what we need to do is to connect the dots between what is happening now and the imperfections in the current Constitution and what needs to be done to correct those imperfections. In other words, the current administration and the MAGA Republicans control all three branches of government now. And look at the result. Congress isn't doing his job despite Democrats' efforts to try. They don't have a majority. So Trump is advancing executive power, riding roughshod over people's rights. And so far the courts, or rather the Supreme Court, has done little about it, and in a lot of ways has made it worse. Okay, so checks and balances clearly are not working. All right, so we need to connect those dots with what are we going to do with the problem, the fact that the Constitution allows all this, and what do we need to do about it? We need a systemic overhaul of the Constitution.
Move to Amend focuses on the Constitution through the single approach. Yeah, there's a lot that needs to happen, but we're starting with this single amendment. And by doing it that way, it's a little easier to grasp, to digest. It's still very daunting because people are still understanding that, well, you're calling for a constitutional amendment, and for the reasons that John has mentioned, either okay, let's go for it, or it ain't going to happen, or amendment. I had to learn about that in school, and in corporate power and corporate rights. What is that? So the glazing over and the paralysis that comes from that is daunting. I would say at the moment, at least since the election, it's a paradox. On the one hand, a lot of people who are coming into, and a lot of newbies coming into this movement now through these individual protests since the election. Um, you go up and talk to them, and they are just outraged at what's going on. How could this happen? Yeah, I'm interested in this, in the like, uh, intellectually. So that's the good thing. But practically, they're focused on trying to stop the abuse. They are reacting, responding, resisting, and responding, reacting, and resisting is important. There's a definite place for that, particularly when your house is on fire, to put out the fire. That's responsible, that's ethical, that's moral. But in the long term, you're always playing defense. You will forever and ever be responding, reacting, and resisting. And what we're trying to do, and here's the conundrum, and here's the paradox, is people understand that in a sense they're just dealing with a single issue, but that's where their energy is. Yet they sort of get this, that it is sort of, it goes beyond it goes beyond Trump. It goes beyond. I mean, look at her. She got more money from individuals and corporations to her campaign than Trump did, and she was backed by Wall Street. Crypto, backed Trump, but let's be real. This is a bipartisan problem associated with the capturing of our government by both both parties. And so, more and more people understand that and sort of are for, more radical reform, if that's what you call it. But at the moment, it's like it's responding, reacting, it's reacting and not proacting. And so it's become even harder, in one sense, to get the attention of people to, hey, go lobby your person to get them to co-sponsor the We the People Amendment, pass a resolution, get your organization to endorse, get your your candidates to support the pledge to amend, maybe go out and take the petition. But, they're trying to put out these fires. They're putting out the fires as opposed to metaphorically, asking who are the arsonists? Don't we need to, focus on the arsonists? So it's a conundrum at the moment. I think in the long term, people are just, in part, are going to say, hey, we can only do so much of this, and part of it will sort of implode. Maybe that if they can't, you can't metaphorically keep kicking the can down the road politically, economically, ecologically, socially. It ain't going to happen. So that will provide an opportunity for change. But the question is, will we be ready? And that's where doing all this other work in trying to help people understand, this amendment is part of the answer, but also how you educate, advocate, and organize for constitutional amendment and do the training associated with it is maybe even more important.
In terms of intermediate things that can be done, I'll just throw out a few. Here in California, there's an allied organization with Move to Amend called MOVI, Money Out, Voters In. And they are advocating for the Foreign Influence Corporation Act here in California. It's going to be reintroduced in the coming legislative session. And what it would do is prevent corporations that have too much foreign money in them from being able to make campaign contributions. That's something that can be done legislatively. It doesn't require an amendment. Similarly, here in California, the California Clean Money Campaign is pushing a measure to legalize public financing, which, believe it or not, is illegal here in California. That they're trying to get that on the ballot for next year. there have been a number of cities where small donor campaign systems have been passed. In Montana, there's an effort to strip corporations of their power to make campaign contributions from the get-go. So since that won't be one of the powers that they originally get from the state, then the argument becomes they can't make them after that. In other words, if you agree to be a corporation in Montana, that is not part of the rights that you would get when you become a corporation, and therefore Citizens United doesn't apply. So there are a number of things going on throughout the country that are trying to get something done that is going to curb corporate power, curb big money in politics, that doesn't go as far as an amendment. We still need the amendment to make the change permanent and make the reforms systemic. But there are other things that can be done in the interim. And by going state by state, you might even hasten a national measure, because big corporations may decide they don't want to have to deal with 50 different rules. They just want one rule. So at any rate, there are other things that are going on, and even though they're smaller scale, they're definitely important. And we're working on most of these things with these more local groups.
We've talked a lot about, and I think it's great that we've talked about who you're talking with, how it's done, what we've been seeing in terms of what people are saying. But curious if there are things that, either one-off experiences you've had that have really stuck, in your head, or just a general sense that's developed around what works, what doesn't work.
I think it begins, in just talking about, the We the People Amendment. We've learned a lot of lessons of how challenging that is, and some of which I've sort of mentioned, in dealing with an amendment, a specific amendment, even that's been introduced in the context of all this emergencies. So there are some very specific, sort of move to amend lessons. The larger lessons of the Constitution, I think, that transcend any movement, constitutional amendment campaign, I think include just acknowledging that most people sort of think of the Constitution is sacred, something akin to Moses bringing down, the Ten Commandments. And so there needs to be a certain degree of honor and affirmation of that, to talk about how there are some provisions of the Constitution that were revolutionary in its day, and were very legitimate in prohibiting the U.S. or any state from granting nobility, and guaranteeing each state a Republican form of government, and all sorts of things like that. So so honoring and acknowledging that the habeas corpus shall not be suspended, although the flip side of that is sort of not so revolutionary, very undemocratic. But anyway, there's been, so that's a lesson. But the other lesson is we have to, I think, face up to the fact of that people who are asking themselves, why are we in this situation now that we're in? Well, in part, it's because of these limitations and undemocratic provisions. And so we have to name those, I think, and do that. And people get it. I mean, we didn't have initially a direct election of senators. I mean, there's now the habeas corpus. You can't hold people intentionally unless there is a cause of rebellion or invasion, which Trump has tried to use, and sort of successfully. So that's sort of the flip side of it. There's, the Commerce Clause. There's, the Supreme Court, a lifetime appointment. No direct election of the president. There's that whole electoral college thing. And so I think that is just so important, to continue to educate around, because that will make the call and the need and the desire to change, and to call for a change to the Constitution, that much more, I think, credible and possible. And another lesson is we need to take advantage of the growing, I think, realities, both political and economic. Obviously the growing authoritarianism and fascism. Hey, do you like this? Sort of our Constitution thus far has not protected us in that way. They've found ways around it. So it's not been a great safeguard, right? And so the politicalization of the Supreme Court, my God, horrible. The economic instability. So there's all sorts of lessons there that we can try to take advantage of. There will be opportunities, I think, again, if one learns anything from previous social movements to get constitutional change. You have to address the systemic oppression that is going on in our society, because race and gender and now sexual differences are being used to divide and conquer and to weaken and to get people to avoid the questions of power that comes from the inequality of wealth and the inequality of power that is, making the rich richer and the poor poor, and the rich even more politically powerful. So we've got to, deal with and acknowledge that we have to call out the systemic forms of racism, sexism, misogyny, and the oppression toward, transgender and the like. The other is, there's no shortcuts to building a movement that's got to be grassroots. It's got to, we've got to work with other organizations. And, the other thing I'll just end on, two things, is, other movements, whether it's the abolition movement, the women's movement, the movement to get gay marriage, there was always direct action, always people who were involved in sort of risking arrest and using that as sort of a moral suasion. And I think that's so important. You're seeing that now increasingly with the growing opposition to the genocide in Gaza, with people putting their bodies on the line, and that's just trying to stop, the legislation, the support for Israel. And then the last thing I'll just say is, the only way we're going to stop, or the only way we're going to get an amendment, only way, is to build a powerful and authentic movement, democracy movement, that is politically and economically independent and that is authentically democratic. Well, how are you going to do that unless you have individual people who feel that we have to have a democracy movement to stop the to amend the Constitution? So we've got to get people to believe that this is possible, that it's doable, that what may be perceived today as impossible over time becomes realistic, becomes eventually inevitable based on external conditions. And toward that, we've got to build this movement that is somewhat impervious to external forces, because the powers to be will come after you. They've done it before with other people. And it's got to be done, I believe, from the movement. I've been a big fan of the agrarian movement, the populist movement of the 1870s, 1890s. And they developed a sequence of how you build a movement that I think is transferable to today. And the 4 steps toward that is, you have to develop the structure, you have to develop the organizations of what that movement's going to be. That's got to be authentic. Second, you've got to figure out, how are you going to bring people into that movement? What's the recruitment? What's the onboarding? What's the way you attract people? For them, it was, we're going to, you're selling your agricultural products, come together, because coming together and forming a union of selling wheat or corn is a lot more advantageous to sell together like a union than it is bargaining individually. And so thousands of small farmers came in and formed the populist movement. And then third, you have to do, radical education to get people to understand what's going on. And fourth, you got to politicize and to develop, a political movement that tries to capture power. And each of those can only happen if the previous one happens first. So I think there's some lessons there that is transferable to what the heck's going on today.
I think some of the experiences that have stood out to me has been the realization that we've been here before. There's that constitutional amendments come in waves. And there's a book by Cowell and Professor Codrington about that, entitled The People's Constitution. And basically, constitutions come in waves, and we're overdue for one. There's another book by Strauss and Howe called The Fourth Turning, in which they argue something similar, and that is, there are cycles to American history, and what we're going through now is just a cycle, and we've been here before. Recently, one of my fellow volunteers put together a video that he entitled the Five Fights. And if you go back and if you look at the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the Progressive Era, the Depression and World War II, and then the Civil Rights and other rights movements, each time the people rose up and beat the oligarchs, the people in power, the tyrant. And I think what we're going through now has a lot of similarities with the U.S. before the Civil War. I think what's going on with immigration is kind of like what happened with slavery. The Progressive Era, because of the vast disparity in wealth and the vast amount of corruption now, and also before World War II, when fascism was popular until Pearl Harbor. So for all those reasons, I think people should not despair, because we've been through this and we managed to not only get through it, but win and come out better each time. And that is one of the major things I've taken out of this whole experience and the educational process that I've gone through with it.
I want to close out with a question that I've been making a point of asking all my guests, but half the time I forget to write it down on the question sheet that I send to people. So that's just how it goes. But, next year is the 250th anniversary of the enactment of the Declaration of Independence. And I'm sure we can imagine the various official messages we're going to get around that. But I like asking folks how they think people with our democracy first, democracy centered perspectives, however you want to call it, how we can take advantage of that moment, how we should be thinking about the 250th anniversary and how we can include that in the ways in which we talk with people.
It's funny, we're kicking that around as a strategic issue of, what do we want to do around July 4th, 2026? And so we're talking about, we may come up with a tea that is, move to bed oriented. That's, declare your independence from corporate rule tea, a beverage, and, use that to, sort of mark, sort of a clever sort of thing. But more seriously, we have oftentimes over the last several years, in fact, used that occasion, since there are parades and festivals and the like where people are outdoor a lot, have used the theme of declaring your independence from corporate rule, from being dictated to. Now, different groups could frame that in different ways. For us, since we're focusing on trying to abolish corporate constitutional rights and money of speech, that's sort of the frame. But and then using that frame then to talk about how we have been oppressed and how there has been authoritarianism under the current system that is akin to the dictates from a king in that era. But again, let's not glorify that era, because the colonists, looked at native people as not even persons but as beasts, and certainly oppressed people of color and women. We had a very imperfect constitution in early on, although several of the provisions of the Declaration of Independence never made it into the Constitution. So that was, a shortcoming there. But I think sort of thinking about that whole idea of independence from illegitimate power, and that we ultimately should be the people who have the ultimate power to decide, to rule, to self-govern, to have democracy, whatever you want to call it, is sort of the frame. And different groups could define it in different ways according to what they think they are being oppressed by the current system. And maybe multiple voices around that same theme, but focused on different frames, would be all to the good. It wouldn't all have to be framed in terms of, corporate rule as being the ultimate authoritarian source. It could be billionaires. It could be, whatever else. But I think that's in part how we're going to move.
Just very briefly, invoke patriotism. This is the civil rights movement on steroids. Get informed, get organized, get active, get out in the street, and get as many people as possible to become a part of this. But I think Americans generally are patriotic, maybe sometimes too patriotic, but this is one time people should be patriotic for the right reasons, to preserve their rights, to preserve democracy. You got to get out there and work for it. No one's shooting at us yet. So it's not as bad as in the past, but it's time to show up.
John and Greg, I really appreciate you both coming on and talking with us, talking about your experiences with Move to Amend, how we can think about the present moment, how we can look into the future, and that idea of drawing from the positive aspects of U.S. history and using those to learn from and guide us and think about the future and drawing strength and energy from. I think that's all really important. So Thank you both so much for coming on.
Yeah, and if people are interested in finding out more about what we do, they can go to movetomend.org. So movetomend.org, there's a whole host, too much information, some people say, that's too hard to access. But and the other is, we have a petition, over 520,000 people have signed it to sort of keep abreast of our mischief making. And if people are interested there, just go to movetomend.org/motion, MOTION. So ways to sort of check us out, what we're doing.